So you may just have heard the notification. The recording's in progress, so we're underway with our in-sessional SIG event today, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Katrina Johnson and Deborah Catabello to talk to us about things in the world of in-sessional EAP. So I'll hand over to Katrina and Deb. Thanks so much, and we look forward to hearing what you have for us. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm going to start. As some of you may know, I recognise a few names. I'm Katrina, and with my colleague Deb here, we are from the Centre for Academic Language and Development at the University of Bristol. And so today, for the first 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk to you about how we've used Carol Evans' Equity, Agency and Transparency framework to promote more inclusive assessment practices in our in-sessional workshops. Then we'll have some time for breakout room discussions before coming back together to share ideas as a group. So I hope that sounds okay for a Friday lunchtime. I'd just like to start by asking if you could give a quick thumbs up in the channel if you're already familiar with this framework. Either you've seen it before or you've used it in your practice. Any thumbs up? Okay. Well, that's good to know. We're going to talk you through the framework together. And as you can see here on the diagram on the first slide, there are three interconnected dimensions to the framework. The first one being assessment literacy, and then assessment feedback and assessment design. And we're going to talk about each one in turn, touching on some of the underpinning concepts before sharing some examples of materials that we use with students in our workshops. Overall, our main aim today is to explain how we've recontextualized this framework in our role as EAP tutors. And Deb is actually now going to introduce our specific in-sessional context here at CALD at Bristol. So I'll hand over to her.
Yeah, thank you. So Katrina and I work mostly with postgraduate students. So we design and deliver academic reading and writing workshops. And one of the aims is to promote student assessment and feedback literacy. And this is because I think we all know that assessment expectations are often unclear to students. So with our workshops, we are trying to make the basis for achievement visible to them. So at CALD, the Centre for Academic Language and Development at the University of Bristol, where we are based, we've adopted the contextualized, embedded and mapped model. So our in-sessional provision is not fully integrated, but is embedded. So we are embedded in usually mandatory units. And so that means that our workshops are open to all students, regardless of their first language. And the workshops are mapped onto the assessments that students complete for those units, although obviously we highlight transferability to other units as well. So this is our context, and is the context in which we've recontextualized the EAT framework, so the Equity, Agency and Transparency framework. And I'm now going to talk about the first dimension, which is assessment literacy. So what is assessment literacy? So Evans talks about students having a good understanding of the requirements of assessments, which, for example, would include being familiar with the marking criteria. So ideally, we want lecturers and students to have a shared understanding of expectations. However, the criteria that students have access to are often the generic marking criteria. And I think we know that these criteria are interpreted differently in different disciplines. So that we feel that part of our work with students is also to raise their awareness of how of the ways of working and thinking within their disciplines. So the disciplinary element is quite important in our workshops. It's important not only because we want students to do well in the assessments, but also because we want students to feel part of their disciplinary community. We know that this feeling of belonging leads to deeper learning. And as we are all language specialists here today, you will probably agree with me if I said that language has a key role to play in making someone feel that they're part of a community, of a group. And so our EAP work is centered on making students aware of the language choices that are expected and privileged in a discipline or in a particular assessment. And we do this by analyzing student samples with students, drawing on systemic functional linguistics. So I'm going to now give you an example of how we do this. So the sample analysis that we do with students where we use systemic functional linguistics. So what you can see here is an extract from a set of materials that we've designed for accounting and finance students. So you don't need to be able to read this slide. I know it's not very accessible. There's a lot of text there. But this is an extract from the assessment brief. So the students were working on a critical review of an article. And in this particular extract, the unit director is explaining to students what he wants them to do when discussing the placement of the article. And essentially what he's saying is that students should consider the wider context. They should not just discuss the article itself. So what you have here, this extract from an assessment brief, is what Coffey and Dunaway call the emic perspective. So this is the perspective of the insider, the lecturer in this case. So I think Katrina and I often, we start with this perspective. So we spend quite a lot of time looking at assessment documentation. So this is the first step. And then we complement this emic perspective with the ethic perspective. So this is us, EAP tutors, applied linguists. And we do this by using systemic functional linguistics. So on this slide, so after looking at the assessment brief, what I did was I looked at high scoring and low scoring samples. And I started looking at themes. So in SF, if you're familiar with SFL, so themes are part of the textual metafunction in SFL, and essentially it's like there are sentence openers. So this is how I refer to themes with students, sentence openers. And so, if you compare these two samples, again, you don't need to be able to read anything. I just would like you to focus on what I've bolded here. So in the high scoring sample, all the themes relate to the wider context. So even if you compare the first, for example, the first choice there, value, relevance, and the study, it is already pretty clear that the high scoring sample meets the expectations of the marker, of the unit director. If you look at the low scoring sample, you see the study. If you towards the end of the extract, you're seeing at the study again, it. What's interesting is also if you look at tenses here, with the low scoring sample, there are a lot of past tenses. So it's this idea that the students is very much staying with the text. So this is just an example of the kind of SFL informed analysis that we do with students, and I think both both myself and Katrina found that looking at themes can be particularly revealing. So this was an example of the kind of sample analysis we do with students to raise their awareness of assessment expectations. And now Katrina is going to talk about assessment feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. So on to the second dimension, assessment feedback, which we understand as developing student feedback literacy. So on the next slide, Deb, in our workshops, as you can see in this diagram here on the left, we focus on developing three main interrelated aspects of student feedback literacy. Okay, so firstly, we want students to be able to respond to peer and tutor feedback by taking action on the feedback they receive, so they can use it to enhance their work or learning strategies, thereby closing the feedback loop. Secondly, we aim to develop students' ability to give and receive effective peer feedback by building their confidence with this highly complex skill, which I think we'd all agree is important for their future studies and professional lives. And we focus on how to give constructive peer feedback with very scaffolded tasks and how to manage their emotional response as well to peer feedback. Finally, we aim to inspire proactive feedback-seeking behaviour in the students so that they feel empowered to ask their tutors and peers for feedback outside of the classroom, and also to seek clarification on feedback that they don't understand. So how do we do this? Well, I'm sure many of you do the same, but in our workshops, we really try and promote active engagement in the feedback process by providing regular opportunities for dialogue. For example, when unpacking tutor feedback or discussing peer feedback with comments. And I think this focus on dialogue helps them to see academic writing as a social and contextual practice, and thereby hopefully fostering a sense of belonging to their disciplinary community that Deb mentioned earlier. The focus on dialogue helps students realise that they can be active contributors and not just passive recipients of the assessment experience, and that, you know, hopefully they can challenge and even reject maybe some feedback they receive. So we hope that this focus on active engagement and dialogue will ultimately help students to achieve what Carol Evans calls the El Dorado of assessment, which, as you can see here in this quote, she describes as the ability to accurately measure the quality of their work for themselves. And I think, as many of you know, this links to David Nichols' idea of internal feedback and the concept of self-regulation. So now we're going to move on to some examples from our materials, and back to Deb for the first example.
Thank you. So the example on this slide is from a workshop for engineering students, and I'm going to use it to explain how we have students develop their ability to give and receive peer feedback. Okay, so here we're looking at peer feedback. So this was my third workshop with these students who I think in total attended 4 workshops over 1 term. And in the previous 2 workshops, we'd done a lot of sample analysis. So very similar to what I've just shown you with accounting and finance students. Now, what happened is that at the end of the second workshop, my students looked pretty bored. So I suggested that in the following workshops that we should focus on their own writing. However, they came to our third workshop with no writing, or at least that's what they said. They said they didn't have any drafts. So it is at that point that I decided to scaffold the writing by designing this table. So the table here, I used it to introduce students, these are engineering students, introduce them to this idea of dialogic writing. So if you look at the table, you know, what I told students was, you know, imagine a text is usually constructed by you, the student writer, your reader, and the authors of the text that you've read. So that was the premise behind the table. And the prompts that you can see here under readers' questions, those were based on the sample analysis that we'd done in the first and the second workshop. After this third workshop, so students worked on their drafts, and then they came to the last one, where the last workshop where I set up a peer review activity. Essentially that involved asking students to upload their drafts to a shared folder, and then I showed them how to add comments. Much to my surprise, I have to say, this activity worked extremely well. And on reflection, I think the reason why it worked well is, first of all, because of the sample analysis that we'd done in the first 2 workshops, and because of that table. So that table, I think, laid the groundwork, because when students came to the fourth workshop, they knew how to assess the quality of their writing. So the assessment expectations were clear to them. Often when I set up peer review activities and I don't know the students enough, those activities don't work. I think maybe because the students don't know what they're looking at, what they're looking for, what they're looking at. So so this is an example of how we work on peer feedback with students. And I think now Katrina is going to give an example on our work with tutor feedback.